Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Ballai. So I'm an assistant professor here at Kent State. Um, I'm so happy that you're joining us today. So today we're having a webinar associated with our Research Coordination Network for Insect Decline. And today we're going to be switching the focus a little bit from insects to more about building the projects around insects and how we build inclusive projects. If you don't know this about me, I worked with the Mozilla Foundation for about a year during my postdoc as a Mozilla Fellow. This was a really life-changing experience for me because it was taking me out of academia and giving me a lot of perspective about what it means to operate projects that are radically inclusive. Now, Mozilla's projects were also very different because academia is very hierarchical, and in open tech, things are a lot more flat, and trying to understand how things worked outside of the context of these normal quote unquote hierarchies was just this whole new world for me. One of the major initiatives that we were working on at Mozilla when I was working there was the Working Open Workshop series. And so this was a sort of peer and Mozilla mentored program for creating open tech projects, essentially incubating projects that were based on open source software. This started with a workshop that we ran in Berlin in February 2016. And so these are actually adapted from the slides from that original set. So it actually spawned, let's see, I need to mouse over the right spot. See, I worked in tech, as you can see. So I'm very good at this. So this presentation is adapted from work brought to you by Aurelia Moser, Abigail Kavanagh-Mays, Xana Marsh, Arliss Collins, Madeline Bonsma, Stephanie Wright, Caitlin Thaney. These were all my mentors when I was working with Mozilla, as well as my co-fellows cohort, Joey Lee, Rick Smith, Jason Bobe. And so we all worked together on developing these things. And so what I'm going to give you today is a highly condensed version of what was a 2-day workshop, which actually became a sort of mini fellowship program where tech leaders were brought in and given sort of resources and a 4-month training period through the Mozilla Open Leaders Program. So a whole bunch of different tech organizations have actually been incubated through this program. We've also branched out to academic co-mentoring models. And so the OpenScapes program is run out of NCS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, led by Stuart Lowndes, who built essentially an academic co-mentoring program where for about half a year, champions is what they were called, people who wanted to build open tech focused academic groups were able to work together. They got some funding from NASA, some funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So what I'm trying to tell you here is I think that there are some really good ideas that were incubated with this sort of set of practices that we developed here. And I'm going to tell you just a tiny taste of all of them today. So the main points of this presentation are, well, we want to work with people, right? We are social creatures and we want to work with others. There's a lot of value in working with others. Many hands makes light work, but we also need to work with people. The mission of our RCN is to catalyze a global network of entomologists. And we can't do that without working with people. Working with people, though, it's tricky. It requires forethought, it requires consideration, and it requires empathy. And so we need to think about how we build our teams in a way that actually addresses those constraints. And so what we need to do is build a flexible and iterative approach, because the thing is, when we build it, we can't just build it and they will come. We have to build it again and again and again, because we don't get it right the first time, and that's okay. We're going to learn. And there we go. So here is the outline that we provided for the Moz Wow, the Working Open Workshop. And as you can see, a lot of text. So I'm just going to focus on 6 elements here today. So talking a little bit about project communication, road mapping, developing contributor guidelines, looking at codes of conduct, event planning, and then this is where we develop our iterations, our personas and pathways model. So a little bit more condensed here, a little bit less text on the slide. So we'll start with some project communication elements. So when we think of welcoming spaces, they give us a good first impression, right? They sort of say, okay, well, I want to be here. They also give us an idea of where we fit in those spaces. So how we can get involved in those spaces. And then we also have some communication about what's happening now or next in those spaces. And so what we want to do is encourage all working groups to develop essentially a README. So in tech, we call it a README. And this is often a text-based file that ends up sort of in the main directory of any sort of tech project. A README is sort of where you go to get information about how to install the software and what the project is about. But within the context of our projects, we want essentially a front door. We want to welcome that for the project. So when you're thinking of your working groups, what we want you to do is think of something that would make everyone, especially potential contributors, feel welcome and excited about being involved. So this is a really important document because this is often going to be the first thing that someone encounters when they're coming up to your project. This is the thing that people use to contextualize what it is. There, I can advance slides. So a README is for you to show what you're doing, for who, and why. So we need to think about not just the scientific question about what we're doing, but to what end? What's the purpose? And also a little bit of a sort of shout out, what makes the project special and exciting? A little bit of guidance about how to get involved. So contact information about who's organizing this. And then where to find key resources. So things like linking back to the status of insects webpage so that people can see the overall context of this work. Related projects, that sort of thing. And so this is all these things that go into a README file. So I told you I'd be going that really fast. That was a morning session right there. Now we're going into the road mapping session. So this is where we think about organizing how people are actually going to be interacting with the project and what is going to happen when. So roadmaps welcome outsiders and set goals for the project. So this is a little bit redundant with the README in that you want to have a little bit of a summary associated with any document that you're creating to tell people how to interact with your project. But you want to have sort of a summary and welcome within a roadmap as well, where you sort of say, this is for this project and we're doing these things. It doesn't have to be the entirety of the README, but remember that when you're creating information products, there is always the possibility of someone just landing on that product. So giving that connection is really important. Then also how to get involved, which we will look at a little bit with the contribution guidelines. And so these are things that can interlink between documents that you create. And then a timeline. So a project summary and a welcome is something that you use to welcome and acquaint visitors to your project. So users might just jump directly to your roadmap. So it's really important for people to know where they are. We also want sort of a front door to say, okay, well, new contributors want to contribute right away often. So giving them a path. how do you get involved? What are the first things that you can get involved with in the project? And then this is where we have an afternoon session about creating a project timeline. And because everyone is doing something quite different in all of their working groups, we would probably need to handle this very uniquely within individual working groups. But what we want to do is look at the project milestones and mapping out what you're working on in order to make sort of clear steps about what to move forward with and where it's going next. Now, this is something that we are working on centrally, is how to build contributor guidelines. Now, within the context of tech, we actually call this document contributing.md, so that's markdown. And so that's a rendered file that gives a new user guidelines for exactly how to contribute to a project. So someone is interested in joining your group, and that's great. But how do we familiarize our new contributors to our group culture? Every group has a culture, right? And so we have expectations, we have particular ways of interacting. There's really nothing more uncomfortable than joining a new space and not being able to see where you fit. And so it's our job as group leaders to think about that path and make that path as seamless as possible. So the reality of building projects is that often when you go it alone, you get stuck. And so you need contributions to kind of push you out of ruts. And so making it as easy and obvious as possible for a new contributor to see where to join, how to help, it also helps you. It also means that you don't have to go to the same completely reinventing the wheel efforts every time someone else joins the group. You have things that you can, infrastructure that you can point them to start them out. So given that we're a big group, we're working on some general contributor guidelines that working group leads can adopt and adapt for their own groups. And we'd like every working group to adopt and adapt the guidelines so that there's common elements which help people move between groups and can work in multiple groups simultaneously. There we go. So when we think about why we would have contributor guidelines, this is important things to think about. We want to think about how people structure contributions. So imagine you're writing a paper and you have a group of people that all come together and say, yes, we want to write that paper. And we all agree, we're all going to work on the paper. And then we come back and we've all written introductions. That doesn't actually help things very well. We need to be able to sort of think about how we divide the labor. We also do this to provide guidelines. So 5 people get together, work on a product, and one person develops part of a model in one coding language, and then someone else develops another part of a model in another coding language. If you don't have those guidelines, we've lost a lot of effort there. There's also sort of the more fussy little things like documenting style. So if you have a particular writing style that you're using, or you're using a particular coding language, in tech, we often have particular sort of local dialects essentially for different coding languages. So are we going to encode our variables as this type or this type? And so that having people all have those guidelines together enables much more seamless contributions and much more seamless integration of those contributions. So it makes everything a lot more efficient. And so the folks that are thinking about this are not just the project owners, but the project contributors and the project consumers. So people who want to go back and sort of look at how things were put together, having contributor guidelines actually helps sort of piece together things very nicely. And so here's actually an example of one that was used in a tech project. This is the contributor guidelines for Atom, rest in peace. It was the finest of the integrated development environments. It enabled you to do coding in all sorts of different things. It had the most beautiful GitHub integration, but like many open source projects, it did have a lifespan. And so it was thriving in 2015 when the screenshot was taken, but it has been sunsetted, I believe is the term that they use to describe it, as of December of last year. But this project had a large community of contributors who were working essentially for free to help keep this project afloat. And the contributor guidelines actually followed a very formulaic pattern. And so you have your information about where to find it. It is within the main branch of the GitHub repository, but that's sort of like the main file right next to your README, essentially, is where you'd want to have it. Then usually there's sort of a greeting or a cheer. Hey, thank you for wanting to contribute. Give a little bit of an introduction to the project, and then break it down into the how-to guide, what you want to contribute and how, and then the style guide. So this is the more nitty-gritty stuff. It's like, well, we want you to use this type of format for your messages about the contributions you've made. Now we're going to think a little bit about managing interactions. So we've got people now contributing, and we want to make sure that we are in some way policing these interactions so that everyone is having a positive experience. So a code of conduct is a really important document that lets people know what constitutes unacceptable behavior. But it also has a couple additional factors. It also gives us guidelines about how to report unacceptable behavior and what those consequences are. I won't go too much into detail about this right now, but we have something that I consider a living document, and we're working on a central one for the RCN, which I'm going to provide this link again at the end of this presentation, but I would like to invite all of your comments on our RCN Central Code of Conduct. And for each of your working groups, I would expect you to adopt this and probably adapt it to any circumstances that you find necessary. And also provide lots of suggestions for us in the Central Code of Conduct, where we can look at creating the most inclusive possible environment that we can. One of the big things that we've been working on is addressing the issue of code of conduct is often about sort of policing behaviors that you don't do, but it's been very focused on discrimination and harassment, and we want to make it broader than that. And so we've been looking at how do we talk about exclusionary behavior and encode that as well. And so I'm going to invite comment on that at the end of this session. Okay, so now we've got a working group, and now we have to have events, things where we are bringing people together in order to do stuff. Now, events can be virtual, obviously, and they can be in person. So right now, of course, we have the example of a virtual event. I just feel like you're all in the room with me here today. So one of the things that you really need to think about when you're developing an event is, what is the point of this meeting? Now, who among you have been at a meeting that could have been an email? That's often from essentially someone who's planning the meeting, not really thinking about what the point of the meeting is. So what we need to do is ensure that the structure of the meeting is aligned with the goals and objectives of the organization. So we might have a meeting to inform people, we might have a meeting to connect people, or we might have a meeting to build. And so those are sort of the broad themes that we've sort of arranged things. And so in the first category, we would have something like an academic conference where we have sort of the sage on the stage model who's talking at people. And so that tends to be very hierarchical. And it's about the delivery of information from those who have expertise and receipt of information by those who need to receive it. When we have the purpose of our meeting is to connect, so to bring people together and catalyze ideas, we might use a different model. So something like an unconference or a networking meeting where most of the time is spent as talking to each other, sort of structured conversations with each other. There might be, some sage on the stage sort of explaining what we're going to talk about next, but most of the time is spent connecting and bringing together and deciding in the conversation. And so that tends to be a little bit more of a flat organizational structure. And then, of course, there is the purpose of building. So where we're actually getting together to do the work. And so we might see an example of this as a co-working session or a sprint. And so a sprint is something that Mozilla used an awful lot to get work done. And in fact, these slides were originally composed during sprints where people were getting together and doing work sort of next to each other. So this is me editorializing a bit, but the purpose of a research coordination network is to connect and to build. And so what we want to be doing is using more of an unconferencing model or a networking meeting model and co-working sessions and sprints. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sprints, if my slides will advance. There we go. I have to make sure my mouse is in exactly the right spot. So we need to think about, when we're making our events, what the overall goals of the event is. So we have to think about the purpose of the event and who the target audience is. We also need to think about things like how many participants. Can we make sure that everyone has sort of a time that they can participate? What's the format that we're using? For physical conferences, we need to think about, or physical events, we need to think about things like budget and spaces where the events will take place. And so thinking about how do we manage the physical presence as well. And so it's really important to make a checklist and plan things in advance to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our participants. And so with sprints, they often had, Mozilla often did these things called sprints where they had both a virtual and a physical component. So what we would have is essentially sites all over the world where people would get together and work on some aspect of a project. And then there would be video links between different hubs. And so we did this as sort of a virtual sprint, but data carpentry materials were actually developed using a global sprint under the Mozilla model, where we actually had, I was at Michigan State at the time, so we had a site at Michigan State, and I was working quite heavily with a site in Poland, where there was a lot of work going on in the spreadsheet management, because that's sort of my poison. I love good spreadsheet management pedagogy. And so that was all developed in sort of this model where we had people together. I think it was about 30 people and sandwiches in Michigan. And then we had people at various sites in the globe working on other various projects. And so different people were working on different projects at those sites, but we are all working together, and we got a lot done in that time period. So sprints, I got ahead of myself. So sprints are short, focused bursts of work on projects or a couple of projects. And the idea is we bring together scientists, researchers, students, coders, librarians, people from all different groups of stakeholders in order to work together in a space where we're pushing forward a project. So why do we run events in general? Well, we want to build momentum around projects. We want to catalyze projects and generate buzz around them. We want people to be excited about them. We also use this to strengthen ties within our community. When you work together, you become friends, you become coworkers. And so you can better empathize with the people in your group if you are working together with them. Also, this is the core purpose. We want to build useful tools. We want to build useful analyses. We want to build useful documentation. But finally, it's simply to give people a chance to work together. A lot of our work is very isolated, and giving people a chance to work together on a project is a wonderful way to build empathy and expand ideas. So one of the most important things about an event is to have event follow-up. So we want to have a clear call to action following the event. We want to maintain the buzz that the event generated. So the amount of energy that went into the event and was generated at the event, we want to keep going with that. And we also want to collect feedback. So we want to evaluate how the event went because we want to see if we can improve it. It's one of the most important elements of planning a project is how are we doing? Are we meeting the benchmarks? Do we need to change how we're approaching it? So once our event is over, we want to take some time to reflect on it and also consider the entire planning process and the feedback provided, which helps us sort of think, well, what does this event mean and how would we do it next time? So just going to have a little bit of water. Things that make a working group work are essentially be continuously welcoming, always welcoming that new feedback, and always welcoming people to join the group. Remember that people who we don't normally picture as our, usual suspects to academic projects are people too. And thinking about how we invite them in is a really important aspect of things. We need to listen to our feedback. And one of the most important things about planning a sustainable project is thinking about how we encourage and bring on new leaders. So we are all but mortal creatures, and we cannot continue all of our projects forever. So if we find a way to generate essentially a succession plan within our projects where we have new users learning how to engage with the project and then taking on leadership roles and eventually becoming the leaders of the project, it allows us to pursue new interests as well. So that's a really important thing to think about. And so this is where we're going to start thinking about this. We're using a tool from the design world in order to think about how we build user experiences. So with the persona and pathway experience, we use essentially the persona tool from the design world to increase user participation. It's about creating solutions to participation barriers. So we need to think not just about how we're gathering people to work on the project for us, but what will participation in our projects do for the contributors? How is our project adding value to the lives of the people who are contributing to our project? Why do people want to join us? And what are we doing that's stopping them? So kind of interestingly, the person who developed this exercise was Anna Marsh, and she had a background in content design and user experience design for museums. So her whole career focus was about engaging visitors in ways that were meaningful so they kept coming back. So while the content and form of a project that we're doing is different from a museum space, the goals for the visitors is essentially the same. We want to provide a valuable experience, something that's participatory and interactive, something that keeps people coming back. And so that's the core element that I want you to take from this. So what I want you to think about is who are the people we need most in the community and who's missing. We can sort of think about who these people are, and we need to think about how our project is actually creating an experience for them. So a persona is a person, a non-specific person who has skills, a level of knowledge, experience. They have a particular identity. They also have needs and motivations and barriers. And one of the things that we really need to think about is what drives this hypothetical person and why would this person join our group? So this is kind of a tricky area because we have to be very empathetic, but we also have to be very careful about stereotyping. So we don't want to use preconceived notions about groups of people. However, we do want to use feedback from people and take it to heart. When people say, this is presenting a barrier for me, you've got to believe them. And so this is where feedback is really important. You use your feedback from your events to create your personas. Now, with the persona, you need to develop a pathway. So this is the journey that users or participants, represented by the persona, take in engaging with your project, from first contact to potential leadership. So growing a community means that your participants are not just coming in, but moving forward. And so as they become more evolved, contributors level up or increase the quality or quantity of their contributions over time. And that's good. That is something that we need to be planning for, right? And this is where we incorporate our feedback. We take event feedback and use it to understand the barriers for the personas that we haven't considered. These are the barriers within and if these barriers exist within your user base, there's also barriers that are presented to people who aren't at the table, despite our best efforts to recruit. We have barriers in all of every project that we do. It means our event has non-inclusive elements that are pushing people out. So the purpose of this exercise is to create a clear pathway. So look at the barriers that can be removed and remove them. Are they inherent to the structure of the project, or are they something based on how we're structuring the project? So think about the pathway that people are coming in, and barriers can present at any step. So simply getting people in the room doesn't mean that it's an inclusive space. We can have when we have a sustainable community, it means that people are reaching these higher levels of participation. So we can have people discovering our group and going, this is not for me. We can have people making that first contact and going, that was not a great experience. I'm not going to participate. We can have people coming to an event and go, I just didn't feel right at that event. Or we can have people that are only getting to level 3 and sort of contributing that way. What we want is people to come back. So reaching level 4, we want to have people networked. This is where they're saying to their friends, hey, this is a great group that I'm contributing to. Come and join me because I am getting a lot of value out of it. And then we want to see people ascending to leadership roles. So we want to see people who started with just discovering our group to make it all the way to potentially leading the group and finding a pathway that's clear for that. So we use this narrative and pathway model to imagine solutions to potential problems or barriers to entry, and not just entry, but entry to each level. So here's an example list of possible solutions, things that we could change about events that make or our working group entirely to make them more welcoming and make people more likely to level up. So we could create and distribute accessible advertising materials. For people with sensory disabilities. We could collect emails at meetings for follow-up and contact so people feel engaged and heard. We can encourage conversation and co-working so people feel like they're getting more of that sort of flat experience rather than the hierarchical experience where they're working together and building their networks. We want to highlight the work of new members and not just super contributors. So this is a really important thing. People who are joining need to know that what they're doing is contributing. And so only focusing on the super contributors really doesn't help onboard people. Scheduling meetings with family commitments in mind. So I can tell you that the worst time in the world to make a meeting with me is at 3 p.m. because that is school pickup. And I can meet just after school pickup, no problem. I can meet just before school pickup, but it is just a mess to try and plan someone else to do school pickup. And so that's a constraint and a barrier that I face personally. Simply appreciating contributions. So saying, hey, I appreciate that you added this to this product is a really good way to help people feel like they belong in a group. And then inviting and graciously accepting feedback. So recognizing when people give you feedback and give you, tell you their barriers, they're engaging in trust. And they are giving you an insight to something that is in their lives that's affecting their participation. Take that to heart, because that's an investment in you. That is showing that they care about the group and they want to see an improvement. So we can redesign things like our communication strategy. We can change how we're doing our event planning or engagement or our facilitation techniques. We can also change how we're approaching our content delivery or skill sharing within the group. But remember that inclusivity and building an inclusive group is always a work in progress. It's not necessarily about getting it all right out the gate. It's about adapting to the needs of the group and making sure that what you're doing is aligned with your goals and values. So one of the things that was said at our recent New York meeting was what we give time to is an expression of our values. So I'd like to thank everyone in attendance or taking time today to think with me about what we can do about meeting our inclusivity goals for the RCN.